Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Hedayah, for the invitation and for considering UNODC and a strategic partner. Actually, my work today will be just giving you a background why we are here today and why we are presenting longitudinal research. So, since 2015, UNODC has been engaged in really advocating for the protection of children from terrorism and violence. And UNODC work is built up to two mandates. One is to counter terrorism, and another one is ending violence against children. But mainly in providing specialized technical assistance to member states that have been overwhelmed with this issue of children associated with terrorist groups around the world. In partnership with these member states, we developed in 2019 a comprehensive approach. It's the only approach that has been from United Nations at the moment in three key areas. One is the prevention of the involvement of children with these groups, the rehabilitation and reintegration measures, and justice for children in the context of counterterrorism. What is central to our approach? These children should be treated primarily as victims. And also is very important that it's very coherent and common approach and a strategy to prevent and respond to this issue. Our approach has been recognized by the General Assembly in several resolutions, and in recognition of this, the European Union support us, and Strive Journal came into life in 2021. You can see we have three main partners, that is Iraq, Indonesia, and Nigeria, that we have been working with since before 2021, but under Strive Journal 2021. What is the importance of Strive Journal? One important part of our integrated approach is how we balance security interests and child rights, and how we look at them as complementary state of looking them as completely opposite forces. It is important for us, and we have two main objectives, of course, under the general mission that we have under this project is to prevent counterterrorism while also protecting and upholding children's rights, gender equality, and international law. But for us, it's important to work with these governments and strengthening policies, strategies, and laws to prioritize children's rights, but also to increase resilience of these children and their environment. That means families and communities. When we were developing this project, we were thinking, okay, there is a knowledge gap here. Nobody has a study and understanding really what are the risks and what are the violations that these children associated with terrorist groups have been when this terrorist framework has been applied. So what we wanted to know is, okay, we need reliable data, we need comparable data, and we need to understand how we make more effective policies and responses without putting children's rights at stake. For this, we thought one main of the components of our work will be research. We need to increase awareness at global level, but also local level. And we need to work on three areas of work. One is we provide a specialized policy and legal guidance to these countries to strengthening the systems to protect these children. We promote also the strengthening of capacity of institutions, but also the practitioners and professionals working in this matter. And we have also the increased capacity of these children. When we work with children that has been calling our attention is we don't give voice to these children. We don't put it at the attention, and we do put it at the center. And this is what we're really trying to do, and we're really trying to evolve and understand what is happening. And without further ado, I will give the floor over to my colleague Claire, who will explain Strive Journal research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dayan. Thank you, all of you, for still being here this late in the day, and I very much hope that we can still bring up some important issues and provide some food for thought before we all leave. So, very briefly, and just one slide on this to set the framework, what was the research methodology for this study that we carried out in order to inform the activities of the Strive Juvenile project? This has been going on over the last two and a half years. We started, of course, with a comprehensive literature review, using much of the work of many people in the room and online to inform the development of our methodology and the positioning of the study. We then engaged in mostly qualitative research with a small quantitative element. The field research we conducted in Iraq, Indonesia and Nigeria. We did this in cooperation both with our UNODC offices in those 3 countries and with organizations working on the ground. So in Indonesia, that was the Habibie Center. In Iraq, it was Social Inquiry. And in Nigeria, it was the Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. So that was extremely important to us, that there was a sort of a perspective, a national and local level perspective in terms of how the field research was carried out. We made a decision in the framework of this project not to interview people who were children at the time of the interview, so to go and interview people under 18 for various different, mostly ethical reasons. What we did do was interview a significant number, I'm trying to remember now the exact numbers, but over 90 altogether, young women and young men who had been children at the time of their association with the groups in each of the 3 countries to understand their experiences, with interesting implications, of course, in terms of, somebody mentioned this yesterday, of like retrospective justification of their acts and how what their memories of what happened tell them. But extremely interesting perspectives, of course, and firsthand, and hearing it from the children themselves, or the young adults themselves who had been children at the time. We spoke to their family members, and we conducted key informant interviews broadly with various different stakeholders on the topic. We analysed all of this and conducted, from the beginning to the end, the research with very careful attention to ethical principles, as is extremely important in all of this type of research, and even more so in the case of children. So this was a key concern for us. We make every effort to not make the children identifiable. We don't use any photographs, etc., etc. In the Indonesian context, this was particularly difficult because, as I think Greg set out as well, there are some cases that are very well known in the media. So, moving swiftly along then, and let me just check to the findings. So, overall, we're looking at the protection challenges that arise from children's association with these groups, looking across 3 different countries in order to get some sort of, it wasn't necessarily a comparison, but at least some generalizable findings and some that are more specific. And one thing that I think is really important throughout, I'll talk more a bit about the central questions and the key findings, but what we were concerned about is what is the difference, what makes the experience of children in groups classified as terrorist distinctive from the experiences of children involved with other non-state armed groups, involved with criminal organizations, with gangs, etc. Because actually, when you review the literature, and Siobhan O'Neill in the room, among other people, has done a lot of research on this, there are a number of commonalities. And we were interested in understanding, well, how does the group being terrorist, how does that affect children's experiences? So spoiler alert, the finding on that is it affects their experiences in 2 ways. One is because in certain cases, or in many cases, terrorist groups are willing to sort of commit more extreme and more sort of appalling acts. And when they involve children, that's part of a strategy to sort of shock. And so that affects children in obviously extremely damaging ways. The other way in which it affects children is because of the counterterrorism approach. Is because, and this is something that we find extremely concerning, extremely worrying, which is the fact that to designate something as terrorist means that states and other operators will justify the use of exceptional measures, and this has been used to basically sideline and violate children's rights. So this is a key concern for us arising from the research. In terms of, I think this is something I won't go into in detail because it's something we've gone through in many of the other presentations. So the ways in which children become associated with terrorist groups are in some ways similar to those, to the pathways of adults, except of course at their level of development, these issues can be much deeper, much more traumatic, leave children in a much more vulnerable situation in their sort of quest for significance and in a search for belonging and so on, and those kind of more pro-social drivers. Of course, and it's interesting, children also express economic motivations as adults do, and we found a particularly insignificant influence of religious ideologies, even though all of the groups we were looking at were very ideologically motivated. In this case, they were all Islamic extremist groups. So this means in the counterterrorism framework we need to be extremely careful, because some of the counterterrorism measures then unintentionally contribute to association. So we saw even at that phase, you know, where children associated after measures had already been implemented, those counterterrorism measures were sometimes cited as reasons for association. And that different factors operate in a different way in different contexts. We basically found, for example, situations where children were more resilient to joining and less likely to join because of family support, and other cases where it was the family support that caused them to join, and it was sort of intergenerational and within the family, and that's what led to their involvement. So we also have to be careful how we define that. In terms of their roles and experiences, the indoctrination and training phase, there was much more focus on physical training. At this point, these children have not really received a mainstream education often. And so again, the religious ideological aspect is sort of less important, and the focus is on a physical training. They carry out many different roles. I think when we think of children involved in terrorist groups, we sort of think of armed combat in a conflict situation, or we think of involvement in terrorist attacks, but there are many other types of roles that they carry out. To a certain extent, these are determined by their age, gender, and other socio-political variables, but not always. So in terms of the gender aspect, and I found not the last, but the one before, the panel on gender very relevant also to the work that we have done. So we did look at the different traumas experienced by boys versus girls. Of course, the vulnerability to sexual violence affects girls more, although not exclusively. It can also affect boys. But at the same time, the stereotypical approaches to responding to girls' and boys' involvement didn't seem particularly helpful. And more than anything, this idea that sort of, and this is what happens in some of the countries we're working in, is that boys, particularly teenage boys, are treated as perpetrators, you know, prima facie, and then girls are always treated as victims. And it doesn't always align with sort of the way in which these roles are played out, and particularly the way in which boys are victimized. And that's a gender aspect that I think is really important. So it's not about, let's just also look at women and girls, but the fact that boys are particularly victimized because they're considered as perpetrators. So then when we looked at the phase of exit, how am I doing for time? Not too well. When we look at the phase of exit, disengagement and reintegration, we definitely found it aligns with some of the UNDP findings, sort of a disillusionment with the group leadership, an accumulation of traumatic experience. We also saw a sort of a positive influence of government campaigns, and the sort of prospect of life after leaving did exert an influence. The challenges, of course, are due to stigmatization. It's also extremely dangerous to leave, so many children decided to leave long before they were actually able to do so because of all kinds of restrictions. And then, so in the longer term, lack of economic opportunities was, and educational opportunities was a key factor in sort of determining the success or otherwise of long-term rehabilitation. And maybe I'll just, 2 more slides. This one is particularly important. We talked long and we analysed all kinds of findings and looked at different literature, understanding this whole concept of coercion and agency when it comes to children. So the key sort of myths that we found is that children are either choose to join a group or they're forced to join a group. And I think this is how we always approach it. We found that this is not a yes or no question, but much more of a continuum. So choice and coercion can overlap for many children, influenced by socioeconomic conditions, coercive situations. So it shouldn't be seen as a dichotomy, particularly given that children in all cases have been victimized. We also, so there's a myth that people who are sort of recruited and have more children who have a more sort of a voluntary style of recruitment, that they then avoid coercion and violence. That's also not true. So they, in many cases, also face coercion and violence. I spoke about this, that boys are at less risk than girls, and younger children are more vulnerable, but actually teenage boys suffer a lot of harm also in this context, and reaching legal adulthood can be a particularly tricky situation where, you know, all kinds of rights fall by the wayside. And again, you know, this experience for children combines vulnerability, exclusion, but also a desire for agency, a certain constrained level of agency, and is often their association results from the state's failure to provide for child rights. And then I think finally, although Dayan will want me to also mention the recommendations, but so we looked, Dayan mentioned also, you know, this tension between the security approach and the child rights approach. We don't see it that way, and the research doesn't show it that way, in the sense that these two objectives can actually be complementary if we do things the right way. So we need to avoid this situation where the terrorism narrative is used to sideline and violate child rights. We need to look at the impact of child association with terrorist groups, the exclusion, the stigma, and so on. If we address these sort of the violations of child rights that drive children and young people into terrorism, then we can also effectively combat terrorism and improve public security as well as human security. So that's why it's important and quite welcome in many of the countries we're looking at, that there's a shift from completely, you know, security-focused perspectives to more person-focused and child rights-focused. And yeah, so finally, and this is just the last slide, I promise. We have many recommendations in the study. The study itself, we hope very much to have published by the end of this year, or at least the beginning of next year. And we set out various recommendations in terms of protecting children from recruitment in the first place as the most important part, actively supporting their exit, prioritizing their rehabilitation and reintegration rather than punitive approaches when it comes to children. And supporting their communities, because child rights are best protected when their communities are involved. Last but not least, we do have a QR code. So thank you very much, and very much looking forward to questions for both of us. Yeah.